Today, we're going to be discussing the concept of deviance, especially how and why people become deviant. The theories we're going to be discussing are applied to both informal and formal settings, such as people just not following, harmless social norms, to more extreme examples like breaking laws in a given society. I'll be giving examples for each theory in order to illustrate the appropriate cases in which each theory might be applicable. Let's get into it. In this video, we'll discuss four theories: differential association, labeling, strain, and neutralization theory. If you guys like this video, I might do another one in the future discussing more theories of deviance, such as the broken windows theory or the idea of the panopticon in society. Beginning with what is arguably the easiest to understand, the theory of differential association basically states that deviant behavior is learned. The more time you spend around people who already do deviant behavior, it's much more likely for you to adopt these behaviors. If you ever heard the phrase that someone got mixed up with the wrong crowd or something similar to those lines, that's the basic premise of differential association. If you grew up in a family that commits crime often, it's more likely for you to also do the same things as them. Introduced by sociologist Edwin Sutherland, in his Principles of Criminology, his theory has these postulates. Criminal behavior is learned. This is very important as it distinguishes a difference from inheriting the behavior. The behavior is learned through interaction in a process of communication. It can be gestures, or even more abstract than that, a person can learn to be a criminal through the nature of symbolic interactionism. The principal part of the learning of the deviant behavior happens within personal, intimate relationships. This means that impersonal forms of communication, such as TV or newspapers, are relatively unimportant to the development of deviant behavior in one individual. When the behavior is learned, it includes both the techniques of the act, as well as the motives, rationalization, and attitudes. In context of crime, the direction of one's motives is connected to a favorable or unfavorable binary attached to relevant legal codes. To people who learn criminal behavior from their close peers, they see the laws being broken as unfair and hence justified to break. The more extreme a person gets to seeing laws as unfavorable, the likelihood also increases of them breaking that law. Differential associations vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. There really isn't a formula or predictable pattern. So one person could spend a lot of time with only one criminal and end up learning that behavior, or another person might have a very brief moment with several criminals, but a much more intense experience, and both become criminals. The process of learning criminal activities are the same as in any other forms of learning. The learner of crime doesn't learn from just imitating someone else, but they can learn behaviors if they were seduced into it, for instance, and therefore they also learn from association. While criminal behavior is an expression of general needs and values, it isn't explained by those general needs and values. For example, a thief can be stealing in order to gain money, but at the same time, there are also people who work honest jobs and don't break any laws to also gain money. The attempts to explain criminal behavior by general drives and values, such as the aforementioned example, have been and must completely be futile, since they explain lawful behavior as completely as they explain the criminal behavior. We can identify some generic examples that follow the theory of differential association. So think mafias and children who are born into these families. As a child, they spend their developing years in close proximity to their parents and family members who espouse negative views towards the legal codes that they're willing to break. As the child learns from his family, they're likely to understand and adopt these views themselves, and eventually, they may become a member of that mafia by committing the same criminal acts themselves. In a different setting, say a white-collar environment, for example, even if a larger culture of a corporation upholds ethical norms such as honesty and transparency, close association with people possessing questionable morals can still gradually transform an individual. Seeing your coworkers steal office supplies or even company funds can lead a person not to do just the same thing, but reach the same conclusions and rationales for breaking those behaviors. This theory applies to any type of crime or deviant behavior, as well as any socioeconomic background. Individuals with middle-class backgrounds are exposed to middle-class values and learn to commit middle-class crimes such as fraud, whereas individuals from lower-class backgrounds might learn burglary instead. However, differential association doesn't explain why some people who are exposed to criminal behavior don't end up becoming criminals. Not everyone who grows up in the mafia becomes a member of the mafia themselves. So anyways, that's differential association. TLDR, by interacting closely with people who already exhibit deviant behaviors, a person is more likely to adopt those values. Moving on to labeling theory, this one's pretty easy to understand too. The TLDR for this one is that labeling theory posits that the self-identity and behaviors of an individual can be determined and influenced by the labels used to describe or classify them. So think of concepts like a self-fulfilling prophecy or stereotyping. There are 4 types of categories when it comes to labeling theory: the conforming, the falsely accused, the pure deviant, and the secret deviant. The conforming is someone who's engaged in non-deviant behavior and is labeled as someone non-deviant. The falsely accused is one who still engages in non-deviant behavior, but is labeled as a deviant. The pure deviant is one who is engaged in deviant behavior and is labeled as a deviant, and the secret deviant is, you guessed it, someone who engaged in deviant behavior but isn't labeled a deviant. That was fucking terrible. In labeling theory, it's important to notice the distinction of 2 types of deviance: the primary and the secondary. And the distinction is when they occur in relation to when the labeling is performed. Primary deviance is behavior done before an individual is labeled, and the secondary behavior is done after the labeling. For our example, we're going to be taking a look at contemporary internet culture. And in contemporary internet culture, there's been a deviant label that's known as the incel, which carries some significant behavioral baggage. The case of the incel, in my opinion, illustrates the example of labeling theory perfectly. First, let's lay out some of the behaviors and stigma attached to the label of incel. For brevity, I'll just be referring to the Wikipedia article on the subject, which states, quote, "The subculture is often characterized by deep resentment, hatred, hostility, sexual objectification, misogyny, misanthropy, self-pity, and self-loathing, racism, a sense of entitlement to sex, blaming of women and the sexually successful for their situation, which is often seen as a predetermined due to biological determinism, evolutionary genetics or a rigged game, a sense of futility and nihilism, rape culture, and the endorsement of sexual and non-sexual violence against women and sexually active people." While some people might proudly self-identify as an incel, for the most part, these are pretty negative things to hold in general society. So let's look at a possible case scenario. Say a white male heterosexual, who we'll name Max, who has no knowledge of what an incel is, begins engaging in a small amount of racism and misogyny because of previous experiences and life interactions. While he's engaging in this incel behavior, the world around him hasn't yet labeled him as one. Society doesn't see him as an incel yet. And so in this current state, he's a secret deviant engaging in primary deviance. It's possible for Max's behaviors to change, but say the people around him and society does catch wind of this behavior, they do find out about what Max is doing. Now, people start talking, and people start calling Max an incel. The labeling begins. Now that Max has heard the term and that people are calling him an incel, he could begin to internalize and accept this label, as well as continue to repeat the deviant behavior associated with being an incel. Now, Max has become a pure deviant. As members in society begin to treat these individuals on the basis of their labels, the individuals begin to accept the labels themselves. In other words, an individual engages in behavior that others deem inappropriate, and others label that person as a deviant. Eventually, the individual internalizes and accepts this label given to them. This notion of social reaction or response by others to the behavior of an individual is central to the concept of labeling theory. Furthermore, it's the negative reaction of others to an individual engaged in a particular behavior that causes that individual to be labeled as a deviant, as a criminal, or not normal. Moving on to strain theory, this is actually my favorite to talk about because it has a chart. I love charts. Who doesn't love charts? Strain theory is the idea that a disconnect between cultural goals and the culturally accepted means to reach those goals is what causes deviant behavior. Let's explain what all the different parts of the chart mean and give an example that can fit into each. So for an easy example, let's set our cultural goal as going to college, and the institutionalized means is to work a job so that you're able to afford to go to college. Starting in the top left, the conformist accepts the goal of going to college as well as the means, which is finding a job and going to work. A conformist is the most normal person in this society. This individual might get a job after their primary education, so that way they can pursue higher education. A ritualist does not share the same goals as society, but they go through the motions anyway. Personally, they may disagree with the why of going to college, but regardless, this person would still get a job in order to pay for college, but their participation is purely materialistic. The ritualist doesn't agree with going to college, but they go anyways. The innovator is the opposite of the ritualist. This person does want to attend college, but for reasons they're unable to get a job. This is where the title of this category comes in. The innovator finds new means to achieve their goals and deviates from the institutionalized means. This person turns to the institutionally unaccepted means of getting money, and they could be paying their college tuition by stealing money from others. The retreatist doesn't accept the means or the goals of their society. So, for the example, after their primary education, they cannot or they don't want to get a job, and they also don't want to go to college. Lastly, the rebel. This person is different than the retreatist because this individual has created completely new goals and completely new means. As a rebel, the individual might fundamentally disagree with the notion of college, but instead of just simply not participating, they might start an online blog explaining to others why they think college is overrated, unimportant, and why people shouldn't go. The strain in strain theory revolves around the disconnect between the means and the goals. This strain is best seen by the example of the innovator who wants to achieve the goals of his society but is unable to by normal means, and thence they deviate from the ways in which people normally do. Finally, we've reached the last theory that we'll be covering in this video, neutralization theory. The name of this theory revolves around how some individuals neutralize the stigma associated with deviant behavior. In a criminal context, the criminal is able to deflect the blame associated with their actions, and through this process is able to justify their actions. There's 5 steps to neutralization in no particular order. The denial of responsibility, the denial of injury, denial of victim, an appeal to higher loyalties, and a condemnation of the condemners. Let's deviate from our usual examples of crime and see how neutralization theory applies to a white-collar criminal. Say an individual who is working at a bank and they had the access and ability to steal money from other accounts and transfer that cash into their own accounts. They might do this for a few months, but they're finally caught, and when they're confronted on why they did it, they might say these things. "I'm not getting paid enough at this job. I had no other choice." The accounts that I stole from were all from clients that had millions of dollars. I stole such a minimal amount, it would have never affected them. These millionaires were all exploiting other people to get that much money. They don't deserve it. The bank is the real criminal, preying on their clients with high interest rates. They're the real thieves. I needed to put food on the table. I did it for my children. As you can see, neutralization theory can explain the rationales that an individual might go through in their heads to justify deviant or criminal behaviors. By neutralizing their responsibility and their guilt, the victim and the victim's injury, they're able to overcome the stigmas surrounding deviant behavior. So now you know 4 of the most important deviance theories in sociology. It's important to remember that not every case of deviance can be explained by one general theory. I find that it's important to learn more about the person committing the deviant acts and understand how they become a deviant. Maybe they learned their behavior through differential association, or maybe they were labeled by society and became a deviant that way. Perhaps they were unable to partake in the same means as the rest of society, so they became an innovator in order to reach their goals. Or they believed their actions were legitimately harmless, or maybe even justified in some contexts. Which theory was the most interesting to you? Let me know down in the comments. That's all for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.